Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Map Room. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and with us this week we have Jared Stone and Nick Morris. We're happy to be back. We've kind of taken a little bit of a break since the election. There's been some drama with the Elections Daily Twitter account, among other things, and we figured it'd be a good idea to just wait a little bit to kind of get all the election results in and have a little bit of time to discuss them, analyze them internally before we kind of give you our overview of the 2020 elections. They were certainly surprised in a lot of ways. As expected, Joe Biden won the presidential race, although by a narrower than expected margin. But on the other hand, Republicans made substantial gains in the House and look set to at least have 50 seats in the Senate, possibly a majority in the Senate, which was something that might not have been anticipated earlier. So we're going to be going into kind of the big races, the big states, what happened and what went down on election night and in the weeks that followed. So I'm going to go ahead and start things off here, kind of talk about the southern states in particular. A lot of the southern states were projected to be competitive in a lot of ways: North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Texas. And some of them went the way we thought they would, and some of them didn't go the way they thought they would. So let's kind of go over first the state that kind of went. Well, actually, a lot of these southern states kind of went in an unusual direction. So I'll start with North Carolina. North Carolina, out of all the southern states, besides Florida, North Carolina was probably seen as the one that was most likely to flip to the Democratic Party this election. Democrats not only were anticipating that they could win the presidential race and the Senate race, but also that they could regain multiple seats in the House of Representatives beyond the two they were favored to win in redistricting, and also could flip one or both of the houses of the legislature, while also flipping a lot of statewide offices. But in reality, this is a really disappointing night for North Carolina Democrats. So I'll kind of show you the most important results of the election night. Although Democrats did target almost every office in the state, it was a pretty disappointing night. So as you can see from this map right here, Donald Trump managed to win the state by around 1.3%. This is a swing from 2016 to 2020, although given there was also a national popular vote swing, whether or not this is really a Democratic gain or just more of a national environment bounce is kind of yet to be seen. As expected, if you look at kind of the counties here, Democrats made a lot of gains where they wanted to. They made gains in Cabarrus County, Alamance County, two suburban counties they thought they could almost flip. On the other hand, Republicans made gains in places nobody thought they would gain. Scotland County, which is a majority white county in southeastern North Carolina, a very Democratic county, one that voted for Obama by double digits, one that voted for Hillary Clinton last time, actually flipped Republican narrowly. And these gains in these rural areas across the state were kind of what enabled Trump to hold on despite losing a lot of the traditional bellwethers in North Carolina. As you can see here, of course, traditionally, as always, Republican strength is concentrated in the western portion of the state, and this remains steady for most North Carolina maps. Democrats made some gains out in the western portion, although it may be a dead cat bounce, just a narrow statistical gain that doesn't really mean anything long term, or it could be some actual, long term benefits. They also made gains in Wake County, where they hit over 60% of the vote, and in Guilford County, where they hit that much. In fact, they did very well in almost every urban county in the state, but that simply wasn't enough to give them the win. On the other hand, the Senate race, they expected to possibly carry even if Donald Trump were to win the state narrowly. But in fact, Tom Tillis outran President Trump's margin of victory. You'll notice no candidate here got a majority, and in fact, both candidates ran behind their respective top of the ticket, but Tom Tillis was able to hold on and win. You notice again, Tillis did a little bit better in some of these suburban counties, Alamance, Cabarrus, while also getting a lot of the benefits Trump got, flipping Scotland County, flipping Pasquotank County, which is a rural county, diverse county that Trump was not able to flip, but that Tillis was. He also was able to do better in counties like Forsyth, Cumberland, Wake, and Mecklenburg than other Republicans. Cal Cunningham, though, did pretty well in the rural areas right here. You'll notice these areas are a little bit less red, specifically in the north, the Piedmont region of the state, the western mountain portions, or Piedmont portions as they're called, than Donald Trump, the margins that Joe Biden was able to get here. But it simply wasn't enough. A couple other races that are worth noting, as Nick Morris has written about at Elections Daily, Democrats were thinking they could take over both houses, one or both of the houses of the North Carolina legislature, but this wasn't ultimately able to happen. In the state House of Representatives, Republicans actually gained, or actually that's the regular House of Representatives, where Democrats gained the two seats they were expected to and didn't gain anything else. So it's a 9-5 majority now. But in the state Senate and the state House, Democrats are able to gain one seat in the state Senate. This is because of redistricting, but they lost the New Hanover County seat, even as they won New Hanover County statewide. In the state House of Representatives, a similar story. Democrats expected to make gains here, but in fact, they actually lost seats. They lost four seats compared to the previous election cycle. So really, not a great night for North Carolina, Democrats. What did Republicans also gain? They swept all of the Court of Appeals races, meaning the Court of Appeals in North Carolina, important for redistricting, is now a Republican majority and a decisive one at that. Republicans also appear to have swept all the Supreme Court races and to have held all of the competitive statewide races and the 10 Council of State races, except for the governor and a couple other offices, kept their majority there. So overall, a good night for North Carolina Republicans. Another state where Republicans had a good night was Texas. Texas was expected to be competitive. We did a 3-episode series on Texas earlier this year. And in fact, Texas was a little bit more competitive than last time, but President Trump was still able to win the state by around 5.5 points. How was he able to do this? Well, he was able to overcome losing counties like Tarrant, losing counties like Fort Bend, and losing counties around Austin by making substantial gains in some of these rural areas, and also in the Rio Grande Valley, where he was able to pull margins that Republicans have not seen in decades. He was able to flip Zapata County, which is a county that borders Mexico, Republican for the first time maybe ever. In some of these other counties up around here, fracking counties, counties with heavily rural populations, he also made gains. And also in counties like Cameron and Hidalgo, these are urban counties situated along the border, Donald Trump was able to pull back to margins you would have expected under George W. Bush's administration. Obviously, Republicans are really excited about this trend long term, and Democrats are kind of distraught over this because they finally got the Rio Grande Valley turnout they had been expecting for years to go to Democrats. But in reality, all of these votes seemingly went to the Republican Party. In the Senate race, a similar story. John Cornyn was able to win by a larger margin, but he didn't perform quite as well in the Rio Grande Valley. He won with a little bit of a different coalition. You'll notice he won Tarrant County. He won, a county along the Austin area that Trump lost. So overall, a very good night for him as well. Finally, one more state where Republicans did really well was in Florida. Florida was the shocker of election night. If you followed our election night stream, you'll notice that we were kind of surprised as the election results came in because Donald Trump easily won Florida. In fact, it might be possible to say that Florida is no longer a swing state. I wouldn't go that far yet, but making gains in Florida while losing ground nationally is definitely not a good combination. How was Trump able to do this? Well, a large part of it was in South Florida. You'll notice right here, Miami-Dade County was a county that Hillary Clinton won by 30 points last time. Donald Trump only lost the county by 7 points. He gained over 200,000 voters, or around 200,000 voters, from his last election, while Joe Biden lost 7,000 from Hillary Clinton. In other words, almost every single new voter that turned out in Miami-Dade County, statistically speaking, went for Trump. Another county he did pretty well in was Palm Beach. He didn't actually lose ground in Orange County, which is home to Orlando, and he actually did better in places like Osceola. However, his margin in these rural areas was so substantial, even if that Miami-Dade turnout hadn't been what had happened, if it had gone exactly the same way it did in 2016, Donald Trump still would have won Florida. So it wasn't just Miami-Dade. It was gains throughout the rest of Florida. Long term, Republicans are really excited about this, especially with their gains with Cuban voters and Hispanic voters of all nationalities in the south of Florida. That they're pretty excited about their prospects long term in Florida. What's the one state that didn't go the way Republicans wanted to in the South? Well, it's Georgia. We're not going to pat ourselves on the back too much here because we ultimately didn't have the guts to make this call. We did call North Carolina before the election. We projected it would go to Biden, and we projected that Georgia would go to Trump, even though I had written an article about the possibility of Georgia voting to the left of North Carolina. We ultimately didn't follow through with that prediction, and I'm disappointed we didn't, and that's a decision that's on me, and mainly because Joe Biden actually did win Georgia. Georgia voted well to the left of North Carolina. And how was he able to do this? By the turnout in the Atlanta metro area. Places like Cobb County, Gwinnett County, specifically were what were able to flip the state for Joe Biden. very narrowly so, around 10,000 votes, 13,000 votes. So obviously, Democrats are really excited about Georgia right now, and there are two Senate races that are actually going to be happening in Georgia. The two Georgia Senate elections, the regular election, Senator David Perdue and former congressional candidate John Ossoff. Neither of them hit 50% in the general election, so the race is going to a runoff. Both of these races, in addition to the special election, which is between Senator Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed by Governor Brian Kemp, and Reverend Raphael Warnock, who is the Democratic nominee, both of these races are generally considered to be in the toss-up category. And given the polling errors that we saw on election night, I think people are going to be generally keeping it in this column as the night goes on. A couple more southern races to mention before we shift over to some of the other regions. One of the races that really got a lot of attention was in South Carolina, the Senate race. Jamie Harrison spent over $100 million in this race to try and unseat incumbent Senator Lindsey Graham. Unfortunately for Harrison and for South Carolina Democrats, the results ultimately didn't pan out. As we mentioned in our previous episode of the Map Room on South Carolina, a lot of things need to go right for a Democrat to win in South Carolina. They need to win big margins in Charleston County, which they did. They need to make gains in Columbia, which they did. But they also need to make huge gains upstate in these Republican areas in the northern portion of South Carolina. Ultimately, this didn't happen in either the presidential or the Senate race. While Jamie Harrison did run slightly ahead of Joe Biden, he still lost the race by over 10 points. And this was kind of the story of the night with these races that Democrats were excited about: Alaska, Kansas, South Carolina, even Kentucky to a degree. All of these races were decided by double digits when polls had shown competitive races. In fact, the South Carolina results were kind of disastrous because apparently Jamie Harrison nationalized South Carolina races to a point where a lot of down ballot Democrats who had held on in rural, Republican leaning districts were swept out by straight ticket voting. So in hindsight, this didn't seem to go over very well with voters. As we'll mention later, there are a couple more races where money may have factored in. In fact, in Maine, money may have been a negative overall for the challenger to Susan Collins. But that's kind of our overview of the southern region of the United States. One other thing I'll show you before I go off is the most traditional candidate in Texas, the highest performing Republican in Texas, was Supreme Court candidate Sandra Bland. She was able to win by 11 percentage points, and she recorded more votes in the election in Texas than any other candidate in the history of Texas. A large number of votes, and as you can see, a pretty decisive margin of victory. This is the closest to a traditional coalition map in Texas that we'll probably be seeing for quite a long time, winning counties like Tarrant, doing pretty well in Harris, Fort Bend, areas around Austin, while doing a little bit worse in the Rio Grande Valley. So yeah, that's kind of our overview of the South, and we're going to be going over to the other regions now. As Jared Stone and Nick Morris kind of explained later on, there's also a lot of interesting races throughout the country.
So now I'm going to cover the Western region. So I'm going to pull up the New York Times website, which has a great visual, great graphics for this. So hopefully you can see my screen now. I'm going to go over several of the Western states with the presidential and Senate races and just talk about some of the demographic trends that we saw happening here. But first, to put out a few important things. First of all, turnout was huge in these states. A lot of these states exceeded their previous turnout in 2016 by massive, massive margins. If we're talking about, for example, my home state of Nevada, both candidates in 2016 got within the mid 500,000s. You can see here, however, that Joe Biden got over 700,000 votes, whereas Donald Trump cleared 650,000 votes. So this was something that we saw in a lot of these Western states, is that turnout was through the roof. Also, what we saw is that a lot of these states had countervailing trends, because on one hand, some of these states in the West border the Mexican border and have substantial populations of Latinos, and in some cases, African Americans as well in some of the more urban areas like Las Vegas and Los Angeles. On the other hand, you have some of the more wealthy suburban communities in places like Phoenix, Denver, even around Las Vegas, and then especially in some of the areas around Los Angeles like Orange County. And you saw some opposite trends happening there. So with a lot of these heavily minority areas, you saw a lot of them shift towards Trump, especially along the southern border, and I'll go over that a little bit. And then on the other hand, some of these more wealthy suburban communities shifted heavily towards Biden, and they are largely white. So I'll go over the results now in more specific detail. I'll start with New Mexico, which is actually a very interesting state. Joe Biden won the state by double digits. he increased Hillary Clinton's margin. He actually won a majority of the state. Hillary Clinton only got around 48% of the vote there in 2016. And so Joe Biden did decently well for a Democrat in New Mexico. However, what's really important about New Mexico is actually its Senate race. So I'll pull it up here. So New Mexico had a very interesting Senate race that was not deemed to be competitive. In fact, it was overlooked because some states like South Carolina, Kansas, Alaska were seen as being more competitive. However, New Mexico turned out to be far more competitive than any of those states. You had Ben Ray Lujan, who served in the House. He had a rural district up north, and he was the assistant speaker of the House for some time. And so he ran, and he amassed somewhat of a Beltway agenda. And then he had Mark Ronchetti, who was a weatherman who was known for his performance as a weatherman, and he ran on the Republican side. And you can see here that this race was actually far closer than people expected. It really turned out to be a 6-point race. So last time you had a competitive race like this was actually in 2012 when Heather Wilson, a former Republican member of the House, ran against Martin Heinrich. And that was seen as a very competitive race. And it turned out to be the exact same margin, pretty much, a 6-point race. And so this is something to really look at. Very interesting result here. Since we have the Senate races up, I'll touch on a few more of the Senate races. Going up to Colorado, this is one of 2 states that flipped to Democrats. John Hickenlooper, former governor of Colorado, won the state by around 9%. This is an underperformance from what Joe Biden did. He won the state by a resounding margin. He won it by over double digits, over 10%. It was one of the largest shifts from 2016 to 2020 in the entire nation in favor of the Democrats. But John Hickenlooper was able to win. There was a bit of that incumbency advantage from Cory Gardner, but this is still an easy win for John Hickenlooper. The other state to look at here is Arizona. Arizona had another competitive Senate race. Most handicappers had the state as either leans or likely Democrat. This is because the Democrats had a strong foundational advantage here. Martha McSally lost her race in 2018 against Kirsten Sinema, and she was seen as the underdog almost throughout the entire race. And so this was deemed to be a Democratic pickup. However, it turned out to be a similar margin to 2018. The Democrat won by 2.4%. And if we look in here at the actual results, you can see a few things. You can see that the Democrat did better in Maricopa County than the state as a whole. This is a trend that we're starting to see now, and it really is the opposite of what we saw in the first part of the decade of 2010, which was when Republicans would often do far better in Maricopa County than the state as a whole, largely on grounds of the Republican Phoenix suburbs. Mark Kelly also made gains in Pima County. He did very well statewide, but you can see a lot of these rural areas like Mojave County, Yavapai, Pinal County, which is in exurban Phoenix County. These were holdouts for Republicans. And just one more thing to note here is that you look at some of these counties like Navajo County and Apache County up here, there was a large constituency of Native Americans here, and they turned out very much so as well. And so this helped Democrats be able to flip the state and wrest it out of Republican hands. Going back to the presidential, going back to what I said previously, you can see that Colorado was won 55% of the vote. Joe Biden got this amount. And so an easy overperformance over John Hickenlooper in the respective Senate race. And then Arizona on the presidential top line is actually a very close race. This is deemed to be one of the closer races throughout the entire country. You can see that Donald Trump did better throughout most counties here. He kept Maricopa to a 2-point loss here. So slightly worse than his statewide, but this was still something that was noteworthy. You can also see that Trump really drove turnout in these rural counties. He did better in Yuma County than he did in 2016. In fact, in 2016, he almost lost the county. And this is really a testament to the fact that he was able to rebound his strength among Hispanics, especially border communities like in Yuma County with the city of Yuma. And also some of these border communities in Cochise County, they did better for Trump. Also, Greenlee County, which is a ancestrally Democratic county that voted for Democrats up till very recently, Trump actually gained upon his 2016 margin in this county. So this is something quite interesting. Going to Nevada, which is my home state, I found this to be a very interesting result. You can see that Joe Biden won the state, but he didn't win it by that much. In fact, he won it by the same margin as Hillary Clinton back in 2016. And there were a few different things that happened in the state that sort of conflicting trends that allowed for this to happen. For Democrats, one of the bright spots here was actually Washoe County. Washoe County is home to Reno. Democrats got over 50% of the vote. They won this county by almost 5%. This is really remarkable for Democrats. This is really a marginally Democratic county in 2016. This is seen as a county that could potentially go back to Republicans, but a lot of the suburban growth in Washoe County it really just makes this a more strongly Democratic county. And so Joe Biden did very well here. He also made gains in some of the surrounding areas like Carson City. Donald Trump still won handedly, but his margin was slightly reduced from 2016. Same thing with some of these other exurban counties like Douglas County. Donald Trump did, however, make gains in some of these rural counties. If you look at places like White Pine County, he won it by almost 80%. Elko County, which is one of the more populous rural counties, he won by, again, almost 80%. Mineral County is another rural county, and it's home to the Walker Lake Indian Reservation. This is a county that John McCain in 2008 almost lost. But you can see here that Trump won it handedly. So you may be wondering, with Democrats making gains in Washoe County and Republicans doing marginally better in the rural counties, how did it come to the fact that Joe Biden won by the same amount as Hillary Clinton? Well, you have to look at Clark County for that. Clark County is by far the most populous county in the state. And Trump actually did very well here, considering his previous performance. He made this a single-digit race. He lost it by only 9.4%. And he actually lost some ground in some of the suburban areas. If you look at the 3rd Congressional District, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, among others, this is actually a district that flipped away from Trump to Biden. Biden won it very narrowly by 0.2%. But Trump did well by making substantial gains, especially in some of the more urban areas of Las Vegas, which are home to a large community of African Americans and Hispanics. If you look at the 1st Congressional District, which is in urban Las Vegas, Trump actually did a lot better here than in 2016. He really made gains among these types of demographics. And considering Nevada is a state that has a heavy Hispanic population, as well as a state that ranks pretty low with regard to its college education, these are demographics that really helped Trump not do horribly in the state. And so even though Washoe County is concerning for Republicans, Clark County is actually a decent sign for them. Going to California, and I'll go over this pretty quickly as to not elongate this, Trump actually made gains in California with respect to his overall statewide margin. Some people projected that, or some people stated before the election that Trump would get under 30% in the state. This did not happen. He got 34% of the vote here, while Joe Biden took Hillary Clinton's 61% margin up to 64%. A few interesting things happened here. In some of the Central Valley areas, Trump actually lost. Kern County, he only won by around 10%, which is a drop off from 2016. Tulare and Kings County, he did okay in. Inyo County is quite interesting because he won this county by double digits in 2016. However, Joe Biden narrowly secured this county this year. So that's quite interesting. To touch on a few more, Stanislaus County, which is home to a recently competitive congressional district, the 10th, it was won by Joe Biden very narrowly. It's a county that Republicans could possibly get in 2024 under the right conditions. Butte County was a county that several handicappers like Dave Wasserman projected would be a flip. This did happen. It did flip to Joe Biden from Donald Trump. And if you look at some of these urban counties, like San Diego County, a lot of suburbs here, a lot of wealthy suburbs, which helped Biden get to 60% of the vote here. Los Angeles County, it actually shifted right from 2016, largely on the back of minorities who voted more for Trump than they did in 2016. If you look at several communities within Los Angeles County, for example, Compton, which is a majority Hispanic city that has a sizable amount of African Americans, Trump actually got 11% of the vote here, which is a remarkable jump from 2016. And so among some of these very minority heavy cities, Trump actually made considerable gains. This is one of the reasons why Los Angeles County actually shifted right. I'll finally note that Orange County, which is a county that flipped from Romney to Clinton in 2016, actually remained around the same. And this is because there were some countervailing trends within Orange County. If you go more north to some of the more Vietnamese areas like Westminster, Garden Grove, Trump actually made gains here. Some people assume that this is because the Democratic Party position on affirmative action, which actually helped Republicans among a lot of these Asian American constituencies, given the fact that there was not a lot of support from affirmative action policies here. And so Trump actually made gains in some of these cities. He actually won Westminster, I believe, which he lost handily last time to Hillary Clinton. However, the county remained the same in terms of margin because Trump lost ground in some of the more southern cities, like Laguna Niguel, San Juan Capistrano, and some of these other cities like that. These are very wealthy cities in the southern part of the county that have traditionally voted heavily Republican. In fact, these have been some of the most Republican cities, even within Orange County, throughout modern history. And places like San Juan Capistrano actually flipped to Joe Biden. And so Joe Biden made considerable gains because these are some of his target demographics, namely wealthy white suburbanites. And so Joe Biden made gains in the South generally. Trump made gains in some of the more minority heavy areas in the North. And this really helped keep the county stable in terms of margin. A few other quick things to note with some other states. Washington and Oregon, they went very handedly for Joe Biden. Washington had a gubernatorial race there where Jay Inslee, the current governor, won by a smaller margin than Joe Biden. But what's also interesting is that there was a Secretary of State race there. Kim Wyman's the current Secretary of State. She's a Republican, and she's actually able to win the state, which was seen by many as a toss-up. And so this is a Republican winning Washington quite handedly. Is there anything else I need to go over here? Any other states to touch on?
Maybe Utah.
Utah? Okay, yeah, that'll be my
just really briefly because it did see it's one of the few states that swung to Trump to some degree.
Okay, yeah, and finally we have the state of Utah, which is a state that swung to Trump, and this is mainly because there wasn't a substantial third-party bloc as there was in 2016. Trump did not do nearly as well as Mitt Romney did in 2012. That was really the last time before 2020 that you had a two-party race in the state. Trump lost Salt Lake County. He lost Summit County, which is home to Provo, the wealthy skiing resort town. He also lost Grand County, which he very narrowly won in 2016. He was able to win all the other counties, including San Juan County, which has a sizable Native American population. He won Utah County, which is a huge suburban county, which is very Mormon. He won this county candidly, but it's a reduced margin from Mitt Romney back in 2012. He won Tulare County, which is another suburban county, quite handedly. But really his strongest counties were the more rural counties, including Washington County, home to St. George, and then some of these other counties that surround the state. One county I just want to look at quickly is Carbon County. This is a historically Democratic county. Trump won this handedly. It's as the name suggests, home to carbon as far as the resource there. And so Trump won the state handedly. His margin improved from 2016. He won the state by over 20%.
Okay, so I want to go over the Midwest, which was sort of an area that everyone was looking at, mainly because this was very eventful back in 2016. This is the map of the 2020 election. This is probably something you've seen many times since the election last month. And as you can see, mainly looking from this map, is that all the main action happened in the Midwest. And as you can see, these big three states flipped: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. These were the three states that flipped to Trump and ended up giving him the victory. And they flipped back to Biden in 2020. I'm going to start with Michigan. This was actually the state that swung the most towards Biden of these three states. You can actually look here. As you can see, the Midwest as a whole swung towards Biden. Illinois is an exception. I believe that's mainly because of Hispanic voters in Chicago, but don't quote me on that because I haven't really looked in depth into the state. But as you can see, Michigan, Indiana too, they've had reasonable swings, but this was mainly made a difference in Michigan, which Biden ended up winning by almost 3 points. And as you can see, let me just bring this up really quickly. He gained in many areas of the state. Detroit, not so much. He gained by a point. But in the suburbs, he did gain a lot. In Oakland County, I talked about Oakland County in one of my articles before, which was mainly looking at the state legislature races there. But I did go in depth into my research on this, and this is sort of as close you can get to a rapidly growing suburb in the Midwest as you can get. Michigan is a state that is decreasing in population, which could show bad signs for Democrats in the long term. But in the short term, they have had pretty promising results. As I said, Biden won the state. He gained a few counties around the state, including Kent County, for example. Kent County is a county that Donald Trump won, but actually the margin decreased from previous years. This is a county that has been very ancestrally Republican, but it flipped this year and it went to Democrats by a very sizable margin, really, like a margin of about 6 points. In the rest of the state, you mainly see like very, very uniform swings, apart from like a few like small counties in the middle part of the state. And that's the presidential election. Another one to note is the Senate election. This was actually a lot closer. This was one that was won by Gary Peters by about 1.7 points. It's a race that Republicans, national Republicans really, were quite excited about because they had a promising candidate in John James. John James, I believe we talked about him in our episode on Michigan. He lost narrowly in 2018. He did a lot better than people expected him to, and Republicans thought that was a good sign for this year, where he did indeed outperform his margin, and he did very impressively relatively to what we thought he would, relatively to how we thought he would do. But he still fell short. He fell short by about 1.2 points. But this was probably one of Republicans' best races here in a while, not since really 2016. They had a bad year in 2018, and they ended up losing the state this year. But this is about as close as what you can get to a Republican victory this year. James won Kent County. He won Muskegon County as well, which was a very, I guess you could say, ancestrally Democratic. It's got a college town in there. Hillary Clinton won it. But overall, Gary Peters' margins in like the Detroit area and the Ann Arbor area, Lansing area, is what ultimately caused him to win. And yeah, this is really what a winning coalition, like both in the case of Joe Biden and Gary Peters, that's what a winning coalition looks like. On the House level, things were fairly unexciting. There were a few races that were expected to be like narrowly competitive, but each race went just about the way we thought it would go. There was one flip, if you can even call it that. This was a Republican held seat until 2019, when Justin Amash left the Republican Party to become an independent, and then later a libertarian. So this is a flip, but it's always been a Republican held seat. This is one the Democrats hoped to win in, but they fell slightly short. And as Eric mentioned, I do want to talk about some of the state legislative races, because I did a lot of research on those over the last couple of months. This is probably one of Democrats' best hopes of winning a state legislative chamber in the country, but they fell short. The balance of power in the Michigan House actually ends up being the same. Democrats flipped 2 seats, Republicans flipped another 2. This race, the 19th district, I believe some networks have called it for Democrats. I consider it a Democratic hold. And this one here, actually, I have no idea what happened there, but I believe this is a Democratic flip. I believe this is actually in Genesee County, which is home to Flint. Something I want to mention about Genesee County, it actually stayed very static from 2016 to 2020. This was, like, if you can remember it back in our Michigan episode, this is something that we mentioned. It was one of the counties that Donald Trump improved on the most. Let me just get it up. Yeah, Muskegon County is this one. Oh, sorry, not Muskegon. Genesee County is this one right here. Trump won it by about 8.3 points, which is almost exactly the same as his margin back in 2016. So Democrats might have hoped for this county to revert to the mean, back to the more strong Democratic performances in the pre-2016 era, but those hopes fell short. And as a result, this Genesee County-based House seat actually flipped. Another seat in the Michigan House that flipped was one in Bay County, which is sort of a similar area of the state. And this is not one that prognosticators thought would flip. I actually didn't mention it in my article because I didn't really buy that it would flip. But several people from Michigan that I talked to actually said that this was a sleeper race. This was very much a toss-up race, and one with serious Republican potential. The Democratic incumbent was called Brian Elder. Here we go, the 96th district. Brian Elder ended up losing by 10 points, which is really staggering, like considering that he was considered a favorite by a lot of prognosticators. But this is really a sign of how much Democrats have fallen in these typically Democratic areas in the pre-2016 era. I take full credit for sleeping on this race. I was told by several people in Michigan that it would be competitive, but I didn't really consider the potential. Now, moving on from Michigan, I want to talk about Wisconsin. Wisconsin was another state that flipped to Joe Biden, but the swing actually wasn't that big. The swing was only about 3 points. Wisconsin is similar to Michigan in a lot of ways, partly because it has a dominant suburban area. In this case, it's the Milwaukee suburbs. Milwaukee is a bit of a smaller city, but it does have a very, very large impact on the state. Madison is another area of the state, and these are the two areas of the state that Democrats are relying on, because they did have a lot of ancestral support in this area. They call it the driftless area, and also some areas up north. And in general, Democrats had a lot of voters that they really no longer have, because they've swung hugely to Trump in recent years. But they ended up winning the state because of these suburban areas, such as Waukesha County. You may know Waukesha County because it's something of a running joke on election Twitter. People have joked that it is a crucial county, and in this case, it gave Donald Trump a similar margin to how he performed in 2016. But the fact that he's not gaining back those suburban voters is really a strong indicator to why he lost the state. Another one I want to talk about is a fairly obscure county in the northern part of the state. It's called Sawyer County. Sawyer County had one of the best track records of predicting a presidential election result. I believe it was since 1968. They got the winner right every single time. And this year it broke, somewhat expectedly. Donald Trump did very well there in 2016, and nobody really expected it to revert back to 2012 levels. But this county broke its streak. It voted for a Republican when a Democrat won nationwide, and a few counties around the country really broke their streaks as well, such as Vigo County in Indiana, Valencia County in New Mexico. I could go on, but this is really a sign of the times. And finally, before I go on to Pennsylvania, which is the third state that flipped, I want to talk quickly about the rest of the Midwest, and this has really shown varying patterns. Firstly, Minnesota. Minnesota swung massively towards Biden. I want to bring up this map quickly, because this really shows how much the Midwest varied. And yeah, as you can see in Minnesota, this was easily the state in the Midwest that swung most towards Biden. And this was valuable to him because Donald Trump very narrowly lost the state in 2016. Minnesota has typically been a state with historical third-party support at quite a high level, especially in 2016, where it gave third parties, I believe, over 10% of the vote. So this may have been an area where Joe Biden gained. He gained in the suburbs, namely the Minneapolis and Port area, which is by far the dominant suburban area in the state. He also gained slightly in the Iron Range, which is an area that Trump did very well in.
It's worth noting that Minnesota voted slightly to the right of the nation in 2016, even though Donald Trump lost it. This time it voted by about a point and a half or so to the left of the nation overall, which is a pretty significant shift, all things considered. I mean, we didn't see that in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan. Those states still voted to the left or to the right of the national popular vote. So long term for Democrats, that's probably a positive sign here, is that this has sort of returned to where it's traditionally been, which is a pretty static, inelastic blue state.
Exactly. Yeah, that is definitely a good point there. And down ballot, there aren't very many exciting races. There was a Senate race which was fairly uncompetitive. Tina Smith won it by about 5.5 points over former Congressman Jason Lewis. But the one that I really want to look at is this race in the 7th district. As you can see, Republican flip. Now, Colin Peterson is actually known for two things. One is being a very conservative Democrat. He voted against the party on several occasions in his time in Congress, which has been, I believe, over 30 years. He's been there for a long time. And another thing is that he represents by far the reddest district in the country. Trump won it by around 30 points in 2016, and I believe a similar margin in 2018. He faced closer than expected results in 2016 and 2018, which led Republicans to believe that they could unseat him. At the beginning of the decade, he was seen as fairly invincible, really. So much so that Republicans wanted to draw him a vote sink in the northern part of the state, which be seen as ridiculous now, considering the northern part of the state is a very reliably Republican area. But this year, Republicans went all the way in trying to beat Colin Peterson, and they succeeded. Michelle Fischbach, who is a former state senator and former lieutenant governor, she was an interim lieutenant governor and ran in 2018 and lost. She was the Republican nominee in this race. She's about the strongest recruit the Republicans could come up with in this area, and she beat Colin Peterson by a double-digit margin. Peterson still very easily outran Biden. He only lost by 13.5-point margin, where Donald Trump won it by 30. But still a disappointing result for Democrats. Then going south, I want to talk about Iowa, and this is a state which, along with Ohio, which I'll talk about later, was really a disappointing result for Democrats. Now, if you remember, a couple of days before the election, there was a poll that was put up by the Des Moines Register, who are a very reputable poll. They have had very reliable results in the past, and they showed Trump with a 7-point lead over Biden. And many people doubted this poll. They tried hard to discredit it. Really, I saw many people on Twitter and on social media in general trying to say that it was badly conducted. But it turned out to be very accurate. Trump ended up winning the state by 8 points. He really swept the state. He swept all 4 of the state's congressional districts. I think he even improved on his margins in 2016 in some of those areas, specifically in eastern Iowa and many rural areas of the state. And this support really carried down ballot. In the Senate race, this was another Republican overperformance from what was expected. Joni Ernst, the incumbent Joni Ernst, Democrats thought they could unseat her. They had a decent recruit in Teresa Greenfield, but she really fell short. She did better than Joe Biden, but in a state which we really should now be saying is a safe Republican state. And another thing I want to touch on briefly is Ohio. Ohio didn't really have many races here. It was thought to be competitive, but Donald Trump ended up winning. One thing that surprised me about Ohio was the trends. Now, I was someone who strongly believed that these areas in the coal country region of the state, which saw some of the biggest states towards Donald Trump in the whole country, swings of about 20, 30 even points, they continue swinging Republican. And this is something I never expected at all. In fact, they even managed to carry Mahoning County and generally swept the Mahoning Valley. Mahoning County is one that Hillary Clinton still won, despite it swinging 30 points towards Donald Trump. And yeah, this was a huge shock of the night. I said leading up to the election multiple times, Mahoning County won't flip. So I take credit for getting that completely wrong. The only area where they really gained in the state was in the Columbus area, which is definitely the fastest growing metro and the Cincinnati area. Columbus and Cincinnati, both definitely rapidly growing suburbs. And this is definitely where Democrats will want to look at if they want to make gains in the state in the future. And the last state I want to go over is Pennsylvania, and this is the third state in this sort of midwestern area, which flipped towards Democrats. I want to be relatively quick in this segment because I've been talking for quite a long time. But yeah, really what you saw, this is a state that the results took a while to come in, but as they did come in, the results were very much as expected. Joe Biden won the state. He actually gained in many areas around the state. He pretty much gained in this whole central Pennsylvania region, as well as in the Philadelphia suburb. On the congressional level, none of the races flipped, although several were competitive. The 10th district was seen as a prime flip opportunity for Democrats, but they fell short there. The first district, which was one that Joe Biden won by a pretty sizable margin, Brian Fitzpatrick held on by double digits. This is one of the most extreme examples of ticket splitting in the country. They managed to hold on in the state Senate and the state house pretty easily. New England and upstate New York did swing pretty heavily towards Joe Biden, some of the biggest swings in the country. In fact, Vermont was one of the biggest swings, was actually the state that swung most towards Biden, even more than Colorado. Briefly talking about New Hampshire, I think the main thing to know is the sheer amount of ticket splitting in New Hampshire. Democrats easily won the races for president and Senate, as well as the 2 House seats, Whereas on the state level, they easily won the governor's race and managed to flip the state house, the state senate, and the executive council, which Democrats were expected to do fairly well in. Now talking about Maine, on the presidential level, this is fairly uncompetitive. Joe Biden won it by a sizable margin. On the Senate level, this is actually a race that Democrats were expected to flip. Susan Collins has undergone a lot of criticism in the last few years. For instance, with her vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, sparked a lot of anger with Democratic activists. They really went all the way on Sarah Gideon, the Democratic nominee here, but she really fell short by a very large amount, by almost 9 points. It was large enough, in fact, that Susan Collins actually managed to win outright. Maine has ranked choice voting, if just for context. So if she would have gotten under 50% of the vote, the vote would have been retabulated, eliminating several candidates at a time. But Susan Collins reached that 50% threshold, and she won it easily. She almost, in fact, managed to win the first congressional district, which is seen as safe Democratic.
So now that we've gone through the regional breakdowns, we're kind of going to go over the one thing we've not really gone a lot over, which is the House. The House saw one of the most interesting political dynamics in the country, which is a major Republican gain. In fact, Republicans were expected to lose seats in the House. We expected them to lose seats in the House. Virtually every election prognosticator or outlet expected them to lose seats. Well, it turns out that Republicans actually gained seats. And not only that, they protected every single incumbent Republican in Congress was reelected, aside from obviously the ones that were primaried or that retired. But Republicans held, that's a pretty substantial feat, is to keep all of your incumbent representatives and not lose a single one of those races to Democrats. And so I've got two kind of maps here to go over, and we'll kind of talk about the results here and kind of the most interesting results. The first one is from it's a map from Wikipedia. The red districts are ones that flipped Republican. Blue districts are ones that flipped Democratic. Republicans flipped 15 seats, if I recall right, while Democrats flipped exactly 3. These 2 seats in North Carolina were from redistricting. If the redistricting was not a thing, they probably would not have flipped either of those seats. And then they flipped this one seat in Georgia, the 7th, which was won by Joe Biden. And it was expected to flip. Pretty much everyone thought that this seat was going to stay in Democratic hands. But all these other districts around the country, you'll notice the 11th district in New York, if you kind of look over here. In fact, New York City had one of the largest swings towards President Trump of the country, went from 17% to 22%, had the largest vote share of a Republican in New York City since the 1980s. Had a pretty solid performance, and part of that was what enabled Nicole Maliotakis to win in the 11th district. You'll notice these 2 seats in Orange County that both flipped. Michelle Steele and Young Kim, 2 Republican candidates, 2 Asian Americans who are immigrants who immigrated as children from South Korea or immigrated in their youth to the United States, both won these 2 Orange County districts, defeating Democrats that won their race in the blue wave of 2018. You'll notice the Michigan seat, as you mentioned earlier, isn't really a Republican gain. This went from Republican to independent to Libertarian to Republican, so it's really back where it started. Nancy Mace in South Carolina's 1st flipped a seat. Joe Cunningham narrowly unseated him. Oklahoma 5, Stephanie Bice unseated Kendra Horn. She becomes the first Iranian American elected to Congress. New Mexico, obviously. Utah, Burgess Owens managed to unseat Ben McAdams in a slight upset. David Valadao out in California in a rural Central Valley district that's very Democratic, but has been more open to Republican congressional candidates down ballot. He won his seat back. And then finally, these 2 seats in South Florida, Florida 27 and Florida 26, both went back to the Republican column by around 3 percentage points. The 2 Democrats, Debbie Mercarsel-Powell and Donna Shalala, both lost their seats there to Carlos Jimenez and Maria Elvira Salazar. 2 really strong Republican incumbents, or 2 really strong Republican candidates, I should say. There's still one race that's technically uncalled, the 22nd in New York. There's going to be recounts there. Where right now, Claudia Tenney, the Republican, is leading Anthony Brindisi, the incumbent Democrat, by a narrow margin of under 60 votes, if I recall. But obviously, this is going to go to recount. Iowa 2 has actually already certified their vote, so Mariette Miller Meeks is technically the certified representative. But Congress, of course, has to vote to seat her, and that is what Rita Hart is hoping to avoid, is hoping to take this to a congressional recount or to just have her seated outright, which would certainly cause some some problems for Republican representatives who feel kind of cheated by that, would feel kind of cheated by that result. A second map I have here, which we'll kind of discuss, is the House results. Basically, these are the margins of the House races. You'll notice here a lot of these areas are relatively competitive, within 10 points around the country. And a lot of these districts, like North Carolina's first, was redrawn. Some other areas around here, these districts in South Texas, one of them, in fact, one of the Fajita districts was only won by 3 points. Vicente Gonzalez defeated Monica de la Cruz Hernandez by only 3 percentage points in a Democratic leaning district. I've also got these insets down here so you can kind of see the election results. Obviously, Republicans did pretty well in these urban areas. Chicago, New York, getting to see Texas held on to all of their districts in Texas, and also California. But so I'll kind of throw it to the rest of the group here. Which of these results kind of surprised you, and which ones did you kind of see coming? Or basically, what or out of all these races, maybe ones we didn't mention, like some of those Rio Grande seats or other districts, were the most interesting to you?
I mean, the fastest one that you mentioned that's New York 22, and that's like, aside from Collin Peterson, it was one of the reddest districts held by a Democrat before 2020, and I fully expected after all of these red seat Democrats losing, I fully expected him to lose. But the fact that he's made it so close is really amazing. And the other one that surprised me is Texas 23, which was widely expected to be a Democratic flip, but the Republican running there, Tony Gonzalez, he managed to hold that seat, which was
and this is a seat that stretches from El Paso to Bayard County, through a lot of these through a lot of these Hispanic areas that have trended heavily Republican in the 2020 election, which was able to overcome the swings that you kind of saw in Bayard County, which is where Tony Gonzalez is actually from. If you look at his residence, that's definitely one that surprised us. We had this, I think, likely Democratic. Nobody saw this one coming, I don't think. Gina Ortiz-Jones was generally considered the favorite to win back the seat after Will Hurd, the Republican incumbent, decided to retire rather than run for re-election.
Yeah, I was going to say Texas 23rd, but you already went over that. So
sorry.
No, it's fine. It's just a really interesting result. I'll go over to it briefly. The 26th district in Florida with Carlos Jimenez flipping that. What's really interesting is that he was seen as a strong challenger. He was the mayor of Miami-Dade County, but he actually underran Trump in this district. This district went from Clinton winning by around 16% in 2016. Trump actually won this by 6%. Carlos Jimenez won it by 3%. So it was an underperformance from Carlos Jimenez, but this is now a Republican-leaning district, at least in terms of this election. And so he was able to win. Georgia 6 was also a district that I found really interesting. It was a one that Romney won by around 20%. Trump won it by 2%. Joe Biden won it by around 11%, 55 to 44. Lucy McBath, the Democratic incumbent there, underran Joe Biden. She won by around 9%, but just a really remarkable shift towards Democrats. It's really indicative of some of the suburban gains they made in Atlanta that have made the state much, much more friendly to Democrats.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely one that was looked at as a lower tier Republican target this time, because of obviously Lucy McBath being a fairly strong incumbent and the Republican candidate Karen Handel, who had lost in the district last time, not being that strong. One that I want to mention, a couple actually, are in the Driftless region, which would be Wisconsin's 3rd congressional district, and actually Wisconsin 3rd, Minnesota 2nd, I believe, and Illinois 17. The 17th, Trump narrowly won this district. If you look at the vote totals, he narrowly won it. And Sherry Bustos, who was the chair of the DCCC, generally seen as having done a fairly poor job in hindsight, obviously, given they basically blew this election. She only narrowly unseated narrowly held on against a Republican in the district. They had to spend money here in the last few weeks to try and keep her afloat right here. This is a district that's heavily gerrymandered. It draws in parts of Peoria and Rockford, Rock Island, basically tries to draw in all the Democrats it can. But even then, this region as a whole is just leaning Republican, as you can see from Iowa 1, even Iowa 2 to a degree. Wisconsin's 3rd was also interesting. The Democratic incumbent there, Ron Kine, managed to hold on by about 3 points against a Republican candidate who was decent, but had a pretty substantial scandal in the last month of the election, where it had come out that a book that he had written, he had talked about exposing his genitals in front of police officers, female police officers. But it doesn't seem to matter here. This district as a whole is actually trending heavily Republican. And so, long term, this is one that Republicans are going to hope to flip in the next election cycle. Actually, one more in this driftless region I want to mention is, of course, Minnesota second. Most people had this rated as a safe or a likely Democratic seat. I believe we had it at likely. But the Angie Craig only was able to hold on by around 2 to 3 percentage points against Tyler Custer, who's a Republican. We had interviewed him earlier in the cycle, and he was actually one of the few Republicans to be outraising the Democratic candidate for a while. So his performance here is fairly strong overall as Trump lost to the suburban-leaning district. Finally, I want to mention 2 districts in North Carolina that really went against what a lot of people were thinking. So North Carolina 11 right here, this was redrawn. Democrats hoped they could flip this district. It went from being a very heavily Trump district to one that was still very heavily Trump, but one that would have almost Roy Cooper would have narrowly lost this district in 2016. Madison Cawthorn was seen as a pretty good candidate at first until some details started coming out about his personal life that were kind of compromising and unfortunate for Republicans. But the Democratic candidate here, Mo Davis, really represents Asheville liberalism, which is definitely out of tune with the rest of the seat. He's arguably a war criminal in a lot of ways, which is not a great fit. And he also gained notoriety for tweets where he had been talking about metaphorically crushing the necks of Republicans, which is typically not something you want to see in a Republican district. So the 8th was considered competitive as well. This goes from Cabarrus County to Cumberland County. It's kind of a Thanos district like the 9th, and that it's pretty stable, even though the 2 ends are kind of trending opposite directions. Or actually, in this case, it's the 2 ends that are trending Democratic, while the middle is trending Republican. Patricia Timmons Goodson was seen as a good Democratic candidate, and she managed to only lose this race by around 7 to 8 points. But Democrats are hoping they could really claim this district in the midst of a North Carolina red wave. The one that was actually surprisingly close in North Carolina was North Carolina 1, G.K. Butterfield's district, a rural district out in the eastern portion of the state. This was drawn to be basically less of an African-American vote sink, and it kind of backfired because G.K. Butterfield only won by 8 points. The seat actually isn't even majority black anymore. So in redistricting, you may expect this district to change because I don't think G.K. Butterfield is going to be confident with an 8-point margin of victory in a declining Republican trending rural district. So yeah, hopefully this is kind of giving you a guide as to what happened in this election cycle. Obviously, we didn't go over everything. We didn't go over all the Senate races or all the gubernatorial races, but for the most part, we kind of gave you the highlights of what happened in the election and how things have trended. But we'll be continuing to post more episodes in the future as we kind of get back into the post-election cycle here. So thank you guys for watching. Where can we find you on social media, Jared and Nick?
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is @JacemanPolitics.
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is TossUpReport.
And you can find me on Twitter @DECunningham2. You can also find us at elections_daily on Twitter and elections-daily.com. We're continuing to post articles. We're posting a lot of election maps to kind of give you a graphical overview of what we're a lot of the stuff we showed you in this episode is stuff we've been posting on our Twitter account. So if you've not followed us there already, we're continuing to post a lot of really quality content, I think, in terms of analyzing the election results here. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you on the next edition of the Map Room.